now take leaders' questions under Standing Order 36. Deputy Mary Lou McDonald, please.
Taoiseach, in anguish and despair, the world watches the terrible violence and devastation in Israel and Gaza. Seared on our minds, scenes of civilians killed, wounded and taken hostage. Scenes of homes destroyed, entire neighbourhoods wiped out by military bombardment, lives lost and shattered beneath the rubble. The scale of human suffering and the depth of grief is unimaginable. The killing of civilians in Israel by Hamas was unjustifiable and was condemned. Israel's siege of Gaza, which continues decades-long daily brutalisation of Palestinian people, trampling on their human rights, and the wanton violation of international law must be condemned. Yesterday, we lost one of the world's great peacemakers, former Finnish President and Nobel laureate Martti Ahtisaari. He famously said, "Peace is a question of will. All conflicts can be settled and there are no excuses for allowing them to become eternal." As Israel lays siege to Gaza, international and European diplomacy needs to heed those words. EU Commission President von der Leyen's unqualified support for Israel's unmerciful military attack on the people of Gaza, her failure to assert the primacy of international law, was reckless, inflammatory and dangerous. Ms von der Leyen does not speak for Ireland. Taoiseach, last week you correctly stated that the targeting of Palestinian civilians, cutting off water, food, medicines and the destruction of civilian infrastructure are grave breaches of international law. You described Israel's bombardment of Gaza as collective punishment, and you were right. More than 3,000 Palestinians, including 1,000 children, have been killed so far, thousands more injured, 600,000 people have been displaced. The people of Gaza, a refugee population, are running out of food, water, fuel and electricity. As the wrath of one of the world's most ferocious military forces is unleashed upon them, as their homes and neighbourhoods are decimated by Israel's carpet bombing, Gaza's civilians are left with nowhere to shelter, nowhere to run and no way out. Taoiseach, Israel's actions are not defensive. They are an offensive attack against a beleaguered, impoverished civilian population. It is the horrible crescendo of occupation, annexation and apartheid. This is not defence. These are crimes against human rights perpetrated in full view of the world. And if we don't call it what it is, if the international community doesn't stand unified against it, then history will record this as the defining failure of our generation, and our children and our grandchildren will ask us how this was allowed to happen. Peace and justice demand that Gaza not become the graveyard of international law. So Israel's blockade must end. The bombardment of Gaza must stop and ceasefires called, hostages released and space created for dialogue. Cahardera chur légar cruálach Israel agus bombardú Gaza, níl mór ag an Aontas Eorpa go bheith príomh go son sus cogaí córá agus the lí idirnáisiúnta. Taoiseach, ending the bombardment of Gaza, stopping the violence must be the priority. In my view, that should be the position of the Dáil. It should also be the unified approach of the EU. You'll attend an emergency meeting of European leaders, Taoiseach. At this meeting, will you call for ceasefires? Will you call for an end to the bombardment of Gaza, for dialogue and for the imposition of international law?
Thank you. Taoiseach, please.
I just want to thank Deputy McDonald for raising this very important and very serious matter once again here in the Dáil. And I want to say once again that Ireland unreservedly condemns the brutal attack by Hamas and other militant groups on Israel and the devastating loss of life it has caused. We also condemn the terrorist attacks that occurred in France last week and in Belgium only yesterday. And we also demand the release of all hostages without any conditions immediately. Israel has the right to defend itself and to pursue Hamas terrorists who attacked its civilian population, and we accept that right. However, Israel's response must be exercised within the parameters of international humanitarian law. Even wars have rules. Collective punishment should not be inflicted on the population in Gaza. Citizens must be protected, and Gaza must have access to humanitarian aid. There must be the establishment of humanitarian corridors. There's also a need to prevent the conflict from escalating and spreading to other parts of the region, which is an enormous concern at the moment. This afternoon, I'll attend an extraordinary meeting of the European Council today by video conference to discuss the unfolding crisis and to aim to have a united response from the European Union, building on the joint statement which we issued on Sunday. I expect the Council will repeat its strong support for Israel's right to defend itself in the wake of brutal terrorist attacks which occurred on Israeli soil, and also to reconfirm our condemnation of Hamas. But I also expect, and I hope, that we will call for a de-escalation of this conflict, and Ireland will be calling for a humanitarian pause so that refugees, including some of our own citizens, can get out and supplies can get into Gaza. The conflict between Israel and the Arabs has been going on for more than 75 years. 75 years of wars, of refugees, of terrorism. There is no military solution to this conflict. The solution can only be one based on peace between Israel and Palestine, and based on peace between Israel and the Arab states that surround it. And when the fighting stops, and let's hope it doesn't go on for too long, I think there will be a need for a new peace initiative involving partners like the US, like the EU, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and other countries. But what you have to do now and prioritise over the next couple of weeks is making sure that civilians are protected, that humanitarian corridors are established, and that any actions Israel takes to remove terrorists from Gaza is done in accordance with international law.
Taoiseach, it is abundantly clear that Israel is not abiding by international law, humanitarian law, or the law of wars, as you put it. There are 3,000 Palestinian deaths, many more people missing under the rubble. We have witnessed with our own eyes collective punishment, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, no water, no medicines, no food, and an increased level of desperation. We have seen, and Israel openly called for, forced transfer of the population, another violation of international, in the clear sight of the international community. So I appreciate absolutely the need to condemn the horror that was visited on Israel and the killing of those civilians and taking of hostages. I absolutely do. But I cannot understand or accept your failure to condemn the Israeli onslaught on a refugee population hemmed in what has been described as the world's largest open-air prison. An impoverished refugee population. The answer to this is peace. The answer to this is a ceasefire, not a humanitarian pause, not a de-escalation, a ceasefire, Taoiseach. And I ask you again to make that call and take that message to the European Union.
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach, please.
Thanks, Deputy. Alongside the UN, we have called for the order which Israel has made on Palestinian people to move south, to move to the southern part of Gaza. We've called for that to be rescinded. That isn't an acceptable demand in our view. We've also clearly condemned the cutting off of supplies of water and fuel to the people of Gaza. That's not acceptable. In contrast, what we need is humanitarian corridors, and the European Union is working on that with Egypt at the moment. But Israel does have the right to defend itself, does have the right to pursue the terrorists who attacked its civilian population and bring them to justice. But they must do that within the basic rules of international law. It is the case that Hamas hides itself among the civilian population, but they're not to blame for that. And there can be no excuse and no acceptance of civilians being targeted or civilian infrastructure being targeted in this way.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Holly Cairns.
Taoiseach, the situation in Gaza is a humanitarian catastrophe. Yesterday, the death toll stood at 3,000, more than 1/3 of whom are children. A child in Gaza is now being killed every 15 minutes. So in real terms, by the time you finish responding to my questions, another child will be dead. There's no water or electricity. Food has nearly run out. Even the body bags have now run out. Hospital generators are running on fumes. When the hospitals do run out of fuel, sometime today or tomorrow, incubators keeping babies alive will be switched off. Their short lives will be over then too. Humanitarian aid, food, water and medical supplies is stuck in Egypt because Israel has refused to agree a ceasefire. Israel won't even stop bombing for a few hours to allow citizens of its supposed allies to get out. There are 40 Irish citizens in Gaza. They're trapped. The carnage and terror they're witnessing every second they remain there is unimaginable. Taoiseach, this isn't a war, it's a genocide and an ethnic cleansing. And the response of the EU has not just been inadequate, it has been callous, indifferent and dangerous. This reached rock bottom on Friday when Ursula von der Leyen visited Israel. By then, Israel had dropped 6,000 bombs and on an area half the size of Louth. Thousands were dead and injured, food, water and electricity supplies had been cut off, and the Israeli government had given 1.2 million people 24 hours notice to leave northern Gaza. What was the European Commission President's response to this litany of war crimes and breaches of international law? She stood with the Israeli Prime Minister and offered him the EU's unqualified and unconditional support. She said, Israel can count on the EU. Taoiseach, last year when Russia targeted civilian infrastructure and cut off electricity supplies, Ursula von der Leyen called out their war crimes. When Israel acts similarly, she not only fails to utter a single word of criticism, she goes to the region to offer support for their war crimes in our name. The Commission President's failure to unequivocally condemn Israel's collective punishment of the Palestinian people has undermined the EU's response to this crisis. Given von der Leyen has no authority to override member states' foreign policy positions, her comments also amounted to a serious overreach of her authority. Taoiseach, I am grateful that you and the Taoiseach have been clear that Ireland's position is that Israel are in breach of international law, but it's really concerning to hear your words this morning in this chamber because they're weak. You have an opportunity at today's emergency meeting of the European Council, so I have 3 questions. Would you explicitly condemn the EU Commission President's response to this humanitarian disaster? What will you do to ensure Ireland exerts the strongest possible influence for a ceasefire and de-escalation of violence at that meeting? And what is the government doing to get Irish citizens out of Gaza?
Taoiseach, please.
Thanks, Deputy. The position of the European Union is the one agreed in the statement by the European Council. And that was agreed on Sunday after a lot of conversations over the weekend. And I hope we'll be in a position to build on that position today at the Extraordinary Council of the European Union. It is the case that each EU member state has its own foreign policy. We only have a common foreign policy when we agree to have one and when we can agree joint statements. And while I think that President von der Leyen has done an extremely good job as President of the European Commission, whether it's on issues such as climate, issues such as COVID, issues such as Ukraine, some of the statements that she made lacked balance, in my view, and I've said that to her and have no difficulty saying that. I do think the statements that she's made more recently were more balanced, specifically talking about the tripling of EU humanitarian aid for Gaza and also the attempts that we're making at the moment to organise a UN humanitarian air bridge from Gaza through Egypt. In terms of what we'll be calling for a de-escalation. We don't want to see this conflict spread to other parts of the Middle East, conscious that we have troops in Lebanon and Syria and I'm concerned for their safety. Nobody wants to see this spread to Lebanon or to the West Bank or to other parts of the Middle East. And there are actors who want this to happen, perhaps including Hamas and some states in the region, and we should not forget that. We will stand over Israel's right to defend itself. I hope we all agree in this House that Israel as a state has a right to defend itself and to pursue terrorists who attack it, but we'll be very, very clear that it is our view as a country that must be done in accordance with international law. The fact that Hamas hides among the population, the fact that Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as human shields, is using Israeli hostages as human shields now, that isn't acceptable. We need to call that out too. But those civilians are not to blame for the fact that Hamas uses them as human shields and shouldn't be punished collectively as a result.
I agree that it needs to be condemned on both sides, and we have been clear about that. But Taoiseach saying that her statements lacks balance itself, because it's more than lacking balance to go over and stand with the Israeli presidents and say that they have the EU's support. A genocide is occurring on our watch, and the international community is standing by and letting it happen. And you just saying that you kind of hope to build on a position at the council meeting isn't going to go far enough, and I just want you to please not underestimate the importance of your voice at today's European Council meeting. Ireland is one of very few states willing to call out Israel's war crimes for what they are. We have a responsibility to the people of Palestine to do all that we possibly can in the upcoming hours and days to push for a ceasefire and the opening of aid corridors, because you mentioned that, but the tripling of EU aid to Palestine is pointless unless these corridors are opened before it's too late, Taoiseach. We need to make it unequivocally clear that Ursula von der Leyen does not speak for Ireland, has no right to offer our support and the support of the other 27 member states
Thank you, Deputy.
to Israel as they rain down bombs on innocent civilians. Taoiseach, the UN are calling this an ethnic cleansing, and the EU are failing to even condemn it. The EU officials are still failing to offer any kind of criticism.
Thank you, Deputy,
so how
please.
long more will the EU stay silent at the expense of these people? And will you please use your voice today to represent Ireland on this? The more
Thank you,
minority
Deputy.
the
We're
voice,
way
the
over
more
time.
important it is to speak louder for these people.
Taoiseach.
Deputy, I hope that we can all agree a few things in this House. First of all, that we condemn without reservation Hamas's actions in Israel, and that we call for the release of the hostages immediately without any preconditions. I hope that we will all agree that, just as is the case for any sovereign state, including our own, Israel has the right to defend itself and has the right to pursue the terrorists that attacked it, and to try to rescue the hostages who are currently being held in Gaza. I hope we can all agree on that, and I hope we can all agree on a third thing, that it is not acceptable. It is not acceptable for Israel, in defending itself, to violate international humanitarian law, to target civilians, to cut off civilian infrastructure, or to order people to be displaced to the south of Gaza. I hope we can agree all of those things. I specifically asked about the consular situation, just to say that we are in constant contact with a number of citizens in Gaza and all the relevant authorities regarding their cases. We're also closely working with the EU and other states who have citizens in Gaza too. In terms of citizens in Israel, the main airport, Ben Gurion at Tel Aviv, remains open and commercial flights are available, and we're assisting Irish citizens to depart through commercial means. We also are monitoring the situation at Rafah, where the border crossing situation remains fluid, and we are in contact with relevant authorities through our embassies in Tel Aviv and Cairo and our office in Ramallah to assist Irish citizens who want to leave as soon as foreign passport holders are allowed to do so.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Dr.